In medieval Europe, a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to produce children, especially sons. A marriage wasn't only a union of the people, it was a contract tied to land, legacy, inheritance, and alliances. And when a wife failed to conceive, the world around her turned cold. What should have been a private struggle became a public accusation, a stain on her honor, and, in many cases, a punishment she could never escape. Before we go deeper into these forgotten and brutal traditions, let me know, in a professional tone, from which part of the world you're watching this video. Your comments help bring these hidden histories to life. For many women, the first signs of suspicion didn't come from their husbands. They came from neighbors. Medieval communities were tightly woven, and a woman's body was everyone's business. If a newly married wife did not show signs of pregnancy within a year, whispers began. By the second year, the rumors thickened. The village midwife, the church elders, even distant relatives would exchange knowing looks. There must be something wrong with her, they'd say. Rarely did anyone question the husband. The blame landed squarely on the woman, no matter her health, age, or circumstances. And once labeled as barren, she entered a dangerous zone where superstition replaced science. Infertility was not understood. It was feared. People believed a woman might be cursed, touched by evil spirits, or punished by God. And instead of offering comfort, the community often demanded proof of her innocence. One of the earliest ordeals she might face was a forced fertility examination. These examinations were conducted not by physicians but by older married women or midwives who had authority rooted in tradition, not knowledge. They would question her diet, her menstrual cycle, her bedroom habits, sometimes interrogating her as if she were hiding the secret of conception on purpose. Their tone wasn't gentle. It was accusatory. Every answer she gave could be twisted into evidence of wrongdoing. If the examination yielded no clear conclusion, the church intervened. Medieval priests believed infertility could be spiritual contamination, and therefore, the woman needed purification. The rituals they imposed could be humiliating or emotionally destructive. In some villages, the accused woman had to stand before the congregation while prayers were spoken over her. Not prayers for healing, but prayers ridiculing the sin they believed she carried. To stand exposed before neighbors and family, listening to the murmured judgment of an entire community, left many women in silent agony. But the church wasn't the only threat. Husbands had their own methods of punishment. A man who believed his wife was the reason he had no heir might begin to distance himself, ignoring her, blaming her for every misfortune, or subjecting her to increasingly cruel demands. Medieval law gave husbands wide authority, and society encouraged them to correct a wife who failed her marital duties. Some isolated these women, forbidding them from attending festivals, markets, or social gatherings. Others forced them into exhausting physical labor under the belief that weakness caused infertility, yet the punishment stretched even further. In some regions, barren wives were required to undergo bizarre folk rituals meant to restore fertility. These rituals ranged from drinking strange concoctions to touching symbolic objects, or walking barefoot around sacred stones while villagers watched. Failure in these rituals was seen as confirmation. The woman had brought shame into her household. Superstitions pushed boundaries even more in rural communities. People believed a woman unable to conceive might have been replaced by a spirit, cursed by a witch, or even secretly practicing sorcery herself. And because no one could prove otherwise, suspicion often became its own truth. Women accused of infertility faced more than mockery. They faced fear. Neighbors avoided them, believing their condition could spread. Mothers warned their daughters not to stand close, as if infertility were contagious. But the greatest cruelty came from a ritual known in some regions as the proving. A woman would be forced to undergo a humiliating test, meant to determine whether she was truly incapable of bearing children. These tests varied from village to village, but all shared a single purpose: to place shame directly onto the woman's shoulders. Some were made to swear oaths before holy relics. Others were forced to walk through the village with symbols of fertility hanging around their necks, as if mocking the very thing they could not achieve. Crowds would gather, pointing, whispering, sometimes laughing. The humiliation was complete. Meanwhile, husbands rarely questioned their own role. Male infertility was almost never considered a possibility. Even in cases where a man had obvious health issues, the community still blamed the woman. The logic was simple and cruel. If a man could perform his marital duty, the problem had to be hers. And since men held legal and social power, there was nothing a woman could do to defend herself. If the couple belonged to a wealthier household, the consequences grew even more severe. For the noble class, infertility threatened political alliances and inheritance rights. A barren wife could be dismissed, accused of sabotage, or labeled as defective. In some cases, her husband might pursue annulment, a process that humiliated her publicly, often declaring her unfit for marriage or cursed by God. Once expelled, such women were rarely remarried. Many were sent to live with distant relatives, tucked away where their shame wouldn't affect the family's reputation. For poor women, the punishments were less formal but equally cruel. A husband who believed his wife could not give him children sometimes became violent, emotionally or physically. Some abandoned their wives entirely, leaving them to beg or work in harsh conditions to survive. Others took mistresses openly, parading their infidelity through the village to prove their masculinity. The barren wife became invisible, a silent reminder of a failure she never chose. And yet, despite all these hardships, many women tried to fight the accusations. They prayed desperately in churches, visited healers, begged midwives for remedies, swallowed bitter herbs, and endured endless rituals. Some traveled miles to sacred wells believed to bring fertility. Others placed offerings on altars, hoping for a miracle. Their efforts were heartfelt, driven by fear, hope, and the painful desire to prove themselves worthy in a society obsessed with reproduction. But no matter how hard they tried, some women could never escape the label. Once branded infertile, their identity changed forever, and the punishments continued year after year, shaping their lives in ways history rarely acknowledges. As the years passed and a woman still failed to conceive, the punishments tightened around her like a noose. Medieval Europe was a world where fear often disguised itself as tradition, and the rituals imposed on infertile women grew darker with every passing decade. The church, villages, and husbands all believed they had the right to discipline a woman whose body refused to follow the expectations laid upon it. One of the most terrifying practices occur in communities where superstition held absolute power: the public fertility ordeal. Villagers believed the barren woman carried an unseen impurity or curse, and to drive it out, she had to be put through trials. These trials didn't involve violence in the physical sense, but their psychological cruelty cut deeper than any blade. A woman might be forced to stand barefoot in the town square, while villagers gathered around, chanting prayers and mock blessings. Another ordeal required her to carry heavy stones or clay pots, symbols of harvest and fertility, while being watched by the entire community. If she stumbled even once, if she tremblingly dropped one pot, if a stone slipped from her hands, people used it as proof she was too weak, too cursed, too unworthy to be a mother. And no one defended her. The weight of these rituals wasn't just in the physical burden, but in the eyes watching her. Children whispered, husbands glared, elders waited eagerly for failure. The entire ritual was a trap, designed not to test fertility, but to publicly confirm her shame. But perhaps nothing illustrated the cruelty of the medieval mind more clearly than the remedies prescribed for infertility. Remedies that weren't remedies at all, just desperate, painful superstitions disguised as cure. Women were told to wear certain herbs around their necks, to drink concoctions made of bitter roots, ashes, or animal organs. Some were forced to sleep beside symbolic objects for months, believing that physical contact would increase fertility. Others were told to bathe in cold rivers at dawn, even in winter, chanting desperate prayers as their teeth chattered and their feet numbed. If they returned home ill from the cold, the blame still fell on them. Every failure, every setback, every misfortune was added to their growing list of faults. The church, too, offered its own form of punishment disguised as spiritual guidance. Confession was turned into confrontation. Priests grilled women about their marriages, questioning whether they were pure enough, prayerful enough, or obedient enough to receive God's blessing of children. Some women were commanded to perform extreme fasts or sleep on hard floors to demonstrate humility. Others were told they must attend Mass every morning, no matter how far they lived from the church. None of these acts had anything to do with fertility, but everything to do with control. For women in noble families, the stakes were even higher. A barren wife threatened dynasties. Her body became a battlefield of reputation and inheritance behind castle walls. The pressures grew unbearable. Many noble women lived in silent terror that their husband would demand an annulment. Annulments, unlike divorces, didn't claim the marriage had failed, they claimed the woman was unfit for marriage in the first place. It erased her dignity, stained her name, and often sent her to a convent where she would live out her years in isolation. Some noble women were subjected to humiliating examinations by physicians' men, who had little understanding of women's bodies but plenty of authority over them. These physicians poked, prodded, questioned, and dismissed, and when they failed to find an answer, they quietly reported that the blame likely rested with the wife. A few women were even declared cursed by the court chroniclers, a reputation so destructive it followed their families for generations. But among all these tragedies, the cruelest punishment was one practiced by ordinary husbands in ordinary homes. When he believed his wife was barren, a husband might take another woman into the house, not secretly, but openly, and expect his wife to endure it. She became invisible within her own home. She cooked the meals, cleaned the hearth, washed the laundry, all while watching her husband treat another woman with the affection, attention, and intimacy she desperately longed for. Some women fled. Some ended their own lives. Some fought in quiet ways, holding on to hope, finding solace in prayer, or supporting other women accused of the same crime. But the world offered them little mercy. And yet, despite everything, there were rare moments when truth broke through the cruelty. There were cases where barren wives were finally freed from blame, when their husbands fathered no children with anyone else. There were women who adopted, loved, and raised children not born from their bodies. There were midwives who protected their patients fiercely, refusing to let priests or husbands destroy them. But these women became legends, not the norm. Most stories ended the same way, with a woman who carried pain she could never confess, humiliation she could never erase, and a label that followed her to her grave. But the darkest truth is this: medieval Europe wasn't punishing infertility, it was punishing womanhood itself. Infertility was just the excuse. And when historians pieced together these forgotten customs, they found a system built not on medicine or faith, but on fear. A system that weaponized a woman's body against her. A system that turned private grief into public punishment. This is why these stories matter. Not because they are shocking or tragic, but because they were real. Real women lived these lives. Real women endured these punishments. And real women disappeared from history because society decided they had failed at duty they never had control over. If you want more stories like this, the hidden truths, the dark chapters, the voices history tried to silence, make sure you follow, comment where you're watching from, and share this video with someone who thinks they know the past. And remember, history isn't always glorious. Sometimes it's brutally honest.